Nothing is permanent. In a remote valley, far beyond the traveled roads, where rivers whispered softly and trees bent as if sharing secrets with the wind, stood the temple of Ryusen, the dragon's current. Their time seemed to vanish, or at least, that's what those believed who arrived fleeing the noise of the world. Master Jensei had lived in that temple for more than 40 winters. He was a man with a serene gaze and a slow, deliberate step, and his voice resembled the echo of water brushing against stones. Some said he had once been a warrior. Others believed he had been born old, having never known youth. But no one truly knew where he had come from, and Jensei never spoke of the past. One morning, a young man named Naoki arrived at the temple. His eyes were full of questions, and his heart restless, like an overflowing river. He had journeyed for weeks across mountains, leaving behind his family, his home, and a life that felt hollow and without meaning. He longed to understand life. He longed for peace. Above all, he sought something unbreakable, something that would not change, something eternal. Jensei looked at him in silence as he introduced himself, dusty clothes clinging to his tired body and a voice worn down by exhaustion. "What are you looking for?" the master asked, without yet inviting him inside. Naoki lowered his eyes, hesitating. "I'm looking for something that doesn't disappear," he replied. "Something that lasts longer than days, longer than pain, longer than this body. Something true." Jensei nodded gently and pointed toward the mountain that stood in front of the temple. It was a vast, majestic rock formation, rising into the clouds like an ancient guardian. "Then sit and watch the mountain," said the master. "Stay here. Don't go in yet." And without another word, he walked away. Naoki obeyed. He spent the rest of the day sitting in silence before the mountain. At first, he felt uncomfortable, anxious. His mind wandered back to memories, to what he had left behind. He wondered why he hadn't been allowed to enter. But with time, something began to shift. His once restless gaze became more contemplative. The sun moved slowly across the sky, and with it, the shadows on the mountain. What had seemed unmoving changed color with the light. Clouds cast fleeting shapes across the rock. The mountain appeared to move without moving. Naoki returned the next day, and the day after that. For 7 mornings, he remained there. Each day he saw a different mountain, veiled in mist, kissed by the pink hues of dawn, hidden by rain, golden at sunset. At times it seemed smaller, other times more distant. Nothing stayed the same, not even what appeared to be eternal. On the 8th day, Jensei finally sat beside him. "What do you see now?" he asked. "A mountain," Naoki said with the faintest smile. "But not the same one." Jensei nodded. His voice was as soft as wind rustling through leaves. "Nothing stays the same, Naoki. Not even what we call a mountain. And yet it remains. It doesn't resist. It doesn't fear change. It doesn't try to hold on to any form." Naoki said nothing. His eyes shimmered, but not from sorrow. He had understood something without needing words. A quiet realization had begun to blossom inside him. That was the beginning of his practice. Not through texts, not through rituals, but through the living observation of what changes, and the serene acceptance of all that is fleeting. Naoki was finally welcomed into the temple. There was no ceremony, no solemn words, only a silent gesture from Master Jensei, opening the wooden door, which creaked with the same gentle sound as a dry branch in winter. Inside, the air carried the scent of soft incense and old wood. Naoki asked no questions. He had already understood that in this place, answers did not come in the form of phrases, but through lived experience. The days passed slowly. Time was not marked by bells, but by the sound of the wind, the cawing of crows, and the way light shifted through the wooden lattices. Each morning, Naoki swept the stone garden. Each afternoon, he gathered firewood. At night, he meditated with the other disciples, before an altar with no gods, eyes closed, back upright. One afternoon, while preparing tea, Naoki accidentally broke one of the master's cups. It was old ceramic, glazed in a turquoise hue that seemed to hold a piece of the sky. The cup fell onto the wooden floor with a short, clean sound. It broke into 3 pieces, as if it had been waiting for that moment for centuries. Naoki froze. A wave of heat rose up his neck. He picked up the pieces with trembling hands, silently lamenting what had happened. When Jensei entered the room, the young man bowed deeply, laying the broken remains on a cloth. "I'm sorry, master. I couldn't stop it." Jensei looked at the fragments for a few seconds, then said, "There's nothing that needs to be stopped once it has already happened. Only seen." Naoki looked up, puzzled. "But it was your cup." "It still is," Jensei replied. "Even if it no longer holds tea, it can now show you something it never could while it remained whole." He sat down beside him, picked up one of the shards, and held it up to the afternoon light. The crack, under that golden light, looked like a living line, like a shining scar on the skin of the world. "Things break, Naoki. Sometimes by accident, sometimes by the invisible passing of time. Nothing you touch is permanent. Not you, not me, not the cup, not even this conversation. Then, why do we take care of things if everything eventually breaks?" Naoki asked, genuinely curious. Jensei smiled, as if he had been waiting for that question long before Naoki ever arrived at the temple. Because caring for something, even knowing it's temporary, is a form of love. True love does not cling. It embraces. It doesn't fear loss, because it understands that loss is simply another shape of change. They sat in silence together. Outside, the wind stirred the pine trees, and a few leaves drifted in through the half-open door. One of them landed gently on the cloth where the broken cup lay, a leaf that had once been green and now was red. Red like the sunset, red like fire before it becomes ash. Naoki understood then that the breaking was not the end. It was a transition, another step in the invisible dance of all forms. From that day on, he kept one of the cup's fragments in his meditation space, not as a symbol of guilt, but as a reminder. Everything transforms. The seasons began to turn with the slow grace of a sacred wheel. Naoki grew accustomed to the rhythm of the temple, but not in a mechanical way. Each gesture, though repeated, felt new every day. The sound of water in the bowl, the texture of rice between his fingers, the way sunlight reflected off the grain of the wooden hallway. Jensei often said, "Don't get used to anything. Live as if everything might vanish with your next breath." One afternoon, as the sky darkened with heavy clouds, the master asked Naoki to follow him to the old temple garden. There, among moss-covered stones and wild shrubs, stood a towering willow tree. Its long branches touched the earth, as if weeping. The tree leaned gently toward the pond, its reflection trembling in the breeze, breathing. It seemed just like them. "Look at this tree," said Jensei, as they sheltered beneath its canopy, the first raindrops beginning to fall. 5 years ago, a storm nearly tore it from the ground. I thought it would die. Naoki looked at the base of the trunk. A great scar ran through its bark, an old wound that had never quite closed. And yet the tree had not only survived. It had grown bent, yes, but strong. Its branches had multiplied, reaching out like wise fingers, gently touching the air. "Why didn't you cut it down?" Naoki asked, curious. "Because it was still alive," Jensei replied. "Sometimes, when we think something is finished, it has only changed form. If we cut down everything that's no longer what it once was, we end up alone. Pain changes things, Naoki. but it doesn't destroy them if you know how to see. The master closed his eyes and let the rain fall over him in silence. Naoki followed his lead. He felt the water trace his face, his neck, his back. Not as something uncomfortable, but as a reminder, everything flows, even ourselves. And in that moment, Naoki remembered something he had tried to forget. A year before coming to the temple, his younger sister had fallen gravely ill. She, who used to laugh at everything, who ran barefoot in the rain, had faded like a winter flower. The day she died, Naoki felt the world collapse beneath his feet. Nothing felt real anymore. Everything was fragile. Everything disappeared. "I couldn't accept her death," he said, his voice trembling, eyes averted. "I didn't understand why something so pure, so full of life, had to leave like that. I felt betrayed by life." Jensei opened his eyes. His gaze held no judgment, only deep listening. "And now?" he asked. Naoki looked at the willow. How it swayed without resistance in the wind, how its leaves shimmered in the rain, as if every drop were welcome. "Now I understand." "She didn't leave," he whispered. "She changed form. She's still alive in me, in my memory, in my longing to understand. Maybe even in this very moment." The master nodded with a gentleness that held centuries within it. "Nothing ever truly dies, Naoki. Only those who cling to form suffer when it dissolves. But essence follows the river." The rain grew heavier, but neither of them moved. They remained beneath the willow, soaked, breathing, letting the water wash not just their bodies, but the final resistances of the soul. When they returned to the temple, Naoki was no longer the same. Not because something extraordinary had happened, but because something within him had quietly let go. An invisible thread had loosened, the one that tied his heart to the past, to how things should have been, to the fear of change. He realized that pain was not his enemy, it was his teacher, and that beauty, the beauty he had always searched for, was not in what lasted forever, but in what passed, in the falling leaf, in the broken cup, in the bending willow, in the tear that doesn't last. In that flow he found peace. Winter began to unfold its cloak over the valley. The leaves let go of the trees in silence, and the wind turned thinner, more transparent. Mornings at the temple were dusted with frost, and the steam rising from the cooked rice drifted through the hallways like invisible incense. Naoki woke each day before dawn, walking through the gardens with a paper lantern, watching the puddles turn into frozen mirrors. Sometimes he saw his reflection, warped by ripples. Other times he saw nothing at all, and that too taught him something. One morning, as he gathered firewood near the pond, he saw a black crow perched on a bare branch. The bird watched him silently, with eyes that seemed ancient, as if they had spent centuries witnessing the same human mistakes. Naoki stopped. Something in that gaze disarmed him. It wasn't threatening. It wasn't curious. It was pure presence. Complete. Naked. The crow suddenly took flight, circled in the air with precision, and descended toward the water. But instead of drinking or searching for food, it simply stared at its reflection. Unmoving, Naoki held his breath. There was something sacred in that image. The bird observing its double, and the water returning a quivering, unstable silhouette. One breeze would be enough to erase it, but in that brief moment, there was a beauty too elusive to capture. "Even the crow cannot fully recognize itself," said a voice behind him. It was Jensei, approaching with steps so soft they seemed to leave no weight on the earth. "What do you see there, Naoki?" "A reflection," the young man answered. "A shape that seems real, but cannot be touched. Just like the mind when it clings to the self," said the master. It stares at itself like that reflection, and the more it tries to hold it still, the more it distorts. Naoki looked at the water again. The crow remained there, as if waiting for its reflection to speak. But it didn't. Reflections never speak. They only mimic. Then, how do we find what's real, master? Jensei sat on a nearby stone. His breath was slow, deep, like wind moving through mountain caves. By no longer searching for permanence where there are only reflections. Let everything move. Let everything change. Watch it come and watch it go, your sadness, your joy, your identity. All of it just shapes in the water. But you are not the water, Naoki. Then what am I? The master smiled but didn't answer. Instead, he pulled a small cup from the pocket of his robe and filled it with water from the pond. Drink. Naoki obeyed. Does it taste different from yesterday's water? Jensei asked. I'm not sure, maybe yes, maybe no, but it's still water. And you are still you, replied the master, even though you are someone else each day. That night, Naoki did not sleep, not because something disturbed him, but because something inside him had begun to empty. And that emptiness wasn't absence. It was space. For the first time, he understood what it meant not to cling. He spent hours listening to the creaking of the temple beams, the distant howls of foxes in the mountains, the soft sound of snow falling on the rooftops. Nothing lasted more than a few seconds, and yet everything was perfect just as it was. Before dawn, he returned to the pond. The crow was gone, but its reflection remained, his own, vibrant, fleeting, like a breath that needs no explanation. He leaned down and whispered softly to his reflection, I don't need you to be permanent, just to be here, for now. And with that, he stood up, without looking back. The heart of winter brought with it a deeper silence. The birds had left the valley, and life seemed to turn inward, like a seed waiting in stillness. The entire temple breathed slowly. The disciples spoke less. Their footsteps softened, and even the wind seemed to walk barefoot through the wooden hallways. Naoki felt that something within him was beginning to melt. He couldn't explain it in words, but he no longer needed to understand everything. Some questions were withering on their own, like leaves falling once they've served their purpose. He began to discover a kind of wisdom that didn't come from study, but from accepting impermanence without resistance. One night, Jensei called him to the fire room. It was a small space, its walls darkened by years of smoke. In the center, a slow fire burned in an old brazier. The flames danced unhurriedly, as if they knew there was nothing to prove. Sit, the master said. Tonight, you will learn about fire. Naoki obeyed. He sat in front of the warmth, feeling his face soften in the orange glow. Jensei sat beside him in silence. For a long time, they didn't speak. They simply watched the fire. The wood crackled. Sometimes, sparks leapt like rebellious thoughts. Smoke curled upward, as if searching for an invisible escape. At last, Jensei spoke. This fire you see, it's not the same as it was a moment ago. It is being born and dying at the same time. Every flame you see now won't exist by the time you blink. Can you see that? Naoki nodded. Then tell me, the master continued, what is fire, really? Is it the flame you see, the wood that's consumed, the heat you feel, or the space that holds it all? Naoki hesitated. His mind searched for an answer, but then let it go. He understood this wasn't a question to solve, but one to sit with. It's change itself, he finally said. That which burns, that which disappears, that which leaves behind ash. Jensei smiled. Exactly. Fire isn't defined by what it preserves, but by what it transforms. He paused for a moment, then added, "Our life is like this, a fire that burns for a while. We want certain flames to last forever. A loved one's affection, a moment of joy, a golden season, but all flames change. And if we try to hold on to them, we get burned. If we learn to watch them, they warm us." Naoki stared at a glowing ember resting at the bottom of the brazier. It reminded him of a heart, not a physical one, but something deeper, more subtle. "Master," he asked softly, "have you also lost things you loved?" Jensei looked at him with tenderness. His face didn't show sadness, but a kind of clarity, one that hurt and healed at the same time. "I have lost everything. What I loved, what I thought was mine, even who I believed I was. But because of that, I can now sit with the fire without fear, without trying to put it out or make it burn brighter. Just sitting beside it, grateful for its warmth, while it lasts." Naoki felt something inside him open, not like a flower, but like a shell finally breaking. He stopped seeing his master as someone with answers. He began to see him as a mirror, a clean one that didn't reflect his shape, but his changing essence. That night, when he returned to his room, he lit a small candle and placed it in front of him. He didn't meditate. He didn't think. He simply watched. The flame danced. The wax melted. And in that slow dying, there was a lesson that needed no explanation. Days later, when snow had covered every path and the trees were dressed in silence, a letter arrived at the temple. Mail was rare in that secluded place. Rarer still that someone from the past had found their way to it, hidden deep among the mountains. The letter was for Naoki. It was delivered by a silent messenger, who bowed and left without a word, never looking back. Naoki took the envelope with trembling hands. He recognized the handwriting instantly. It was his father's. He didn't open it right away. He held it on his lap as the weak winter sun barely touched the paper. His breath grew heavy, as if his body remembered before his mind did. Finally, he opened it. It was brief, straightforward. It said that his mother had passed away. No ceremony, no final words, just that. Naoki's mind went blank. No tears at first, no anger, just a vast stillness. Something inside him collapsed, but not with a crash. More like a shelf giving way in the night, when no one is watching. He left the temple without a word. He walked through the snow, aimlessly, until he reached the old pavilion by the pond. There, he sat on the frozen ground and finally he cried. Not just for his mother. He cried for everything he had once believed would stay. For a childhood that would never return. For the hugs he never gave. For the words left unsaid. For that innocent belief that something or someone could last forever. Time passed. He didn't know how long. But when he opened his eyes, Jensei was sitting beside him. The master didn't look at him. He didn't say anything. He was simply there. His presence alone was an act of silent compassion. Jensei didn't ask. He simply took a clay bowl he had brought, filled it with snow, and offered it to Naoki. "Take it," he said gently. Naoki accepted it. The bowl was cold, but slowly it began to warm in his hands. The snow began to melt, turning into water. "What do you see?" Jensei asked. "A bowl of water. And before, it was snow. And before that?" Naoki closed his eyes. He understood. It was cloud. It was mist. It was river. It was sea. Jensei nodded. "And now it's water again. Soon it will be vapor once more. Everything that exists changes form, but it never disappears. The same is true of your mother. She has only changed form." Naoki felt his tears fall into the bowl. He didn't stop them. He didn't judge them. "But it hurts," he admitted. "Pain is natural, said the master. What isn't natural is trying to freeze what has always been water. Permanence is an illusion created by a mind afraid of losing. But nothing is ever truly lost, only transformed. A breeze passed through. A dry leaf drifted to the edge of the bowl, floating gently on the surface, as if it, too, wished to be part of the moment. Naoki watched the bowl for a long while. Then, without a word, he poured it out slowly onto the earth. He let the water return to the soil. It was his way of letting go, of offering his pain without turning it into a prison. That night, in his room, he lit another candle. But this time, before it burned out, he softly blew it out himself and whispered, "Thank you for being here. You may go now." And with that, a part of him, the part that clung, the part that feared, began to let go too. The days passed like mist drifting through the valleys, without asking permission, leaving no trace. Naoki's face grew calmer, though his eyes now held a new depth. It wasn't sadness. It was something else. A quiet maturity, born not from accumulated knowledge, but from having touched the abyss and sat beside it without fleeing. Winter began to surrender to the first signs of thaw. The branches, bare for months, started to thicken. Beneath the snow, the first flowers still slept, patiently waiting for their moment. One morning, Jensei said, "Everything blooms when it is not rushed." That phrase lingered between the temple walls like an invisible fragrance. One dawn, Jensei called Naoki and said they would walk to the Cloud Pass, a high place between the mountains where few reached. There, the wind was purer, and the sky felt closer. They walked in silence for hours. The master didn't say where they were going or why. He simply walked, leaning on his carved wooden staff, breathing like someone who has made their body a temple. Naoki followed him, no longer anxious, no longer questioning. He had learned that destinies only make sense when you don't cling to them. When they arrived at the pass, they found a stone bridge shrouded in thick fog. The abyss beneath their feet was invisible. The bridge seemed to float in nothingness. "Cross," said the master. Naoki looked at it, hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath and stepped forward. Each step was a lesson in trust. He couldn't see the end, only the next step. The wind blew through the stones, and the echo of his own footsteps returned to him like a strange comfort. At the center of the bridge, the fog parted slightly, just enough to reveal something that stopped him completely. A butterfly. There, at the heart of the abyss, a white butterfly fluttered its wings slowly, suspended in the air, without fear, without need to go anywhere. Naoki watched it as if it were a vision. Something inside him trembled. He remembered his sister, his mother, the girl who was laughter, the bowl that was cloud, the willow that was wound. And he understood. It was not about losing or winning, about remembering or letting go. All of that was part of the same dance. Nothing was permanent, and precisely for that reason, everything was infinitely precious. When he reached the other side of the bridge, the master was already waiting, seated on a rock, as if he had always been there. "What did you see?" he asked. Naoki knelt before him, not out of forced reverence, but with the natural gratitude of one who has been touched by truth. "I saw that I don't need things to last. I just need to be awake when they happen." Jensei closed his eyes and nodded. Then he extended his palm. In it he held a fresh, damp red petal. He had not plucked it. He had found it fallen on the snow. He handed it to Naoki without a word. The young man held it between his fingers. It was so fragile, so fleeting. He knew it would soon wither. And yet, it was perfect. He tucked it inside his robe, not to preserve it, but to remind himself, being present is enough. On their way back to the temple, they walked unhurriedly. The fog gradually lifted. The sun was not fully visible, but its light filtered through the clouds like an ancient forgiveness. Upon returning, Naoki went to the rock garden. There, he took a bamboo broom and began to trace new lines in the sand. But he wasn't seeking order, nor form, nor symmetry, only movement, only letting his hands speak for him. And then something strange happened. For the first time, he did not wish the image to last. If the wind erased it, it would be fine. If the rain washed it away also, what mattered was the gesture, the act of being fully present, of living without resistance. Jensei watched from a distance. His lips barely moved. But in his mind, he said, "Now you have understood. The flower does not struggle not to wither. The water does not beg the ice not to freeze it. And you no longer need to be anything other than what you are, here, now in transit." That night, Naoki slept deeply, without dreams. Not because he had no thoughts, but because the silence had become more interesting. The days began to stretch with the arrival of spring. The snow retreated like a guest who knows when it's time to leave, and the temple's cherry trees awoke from their winter slumber, filling the air with petals soft as sighs. The entire temple seemed to transform, not because it had become something else, but because its very nature was change. Each season gave it a new face, and yet it remained the temple, just like Naoki. He was no longer the young man who had arrived seeking something eternal, but he was still himself, quieter, lighter, more awake. One morning, while sweeping the stone steps that led down into the forest, he found a small boy. He was sitting alone under a tree, clothes dusty, eyes wide with wonder. When he saw him, Naoki approached. "Are you lost?" he asked gently. The boy shook his head. "No, I was just listening to the sound of the leaves falling." Naoki smiled. "And what did you hear?" The boy looked up and said, "They make noise when they fall, but then no more." Naoki looked at him as if he were speaking to his younger self. He sat down beside him, and together they watched in silence as the wind loosened pink petals that danced before softly landing on the earth. "Do you live here?" the boy asked. Naoki paused for a moment. "I live where I am, sometimes here, sometimes elsewhere. But yes, for now I live at this temple." "And don't you get bored?" Naoki let out a small laugh. Not mocking, clean, like a bird's first song at dawn. "No, because everything changes. Each time you sweep the same path, you'll find different stones, different dust, different light, and a different you sweeping." The boy frowned, as if he didn't fully understand. But then he smiled, picked up a fallen leaf, and held it high. "So, if this changes, then I do too, right?" "Yes," said Naoki, "but that's not sad. It's a gift, because it means you can be many things in a single life." He said goodbye to the boy and went on his way. He didn't ask who he was or where he came from. He had learned that not everything needs a name. Some encounters are mirrors, brief, revealing, and enough. When he arrived at the temple, Jensei was waiting by the meditation hall. He handed Naoki a small scroll. "What is this?" Naoki asked. "Your turn," the master replied. Naoki opened it. There was only a single kanji painted in black ink. Mu, emptiness, absence, negation, or maybe freedom. The master looked at him with a soft expression. "Now teach, not with words, but with your presence. The way you walk, the way you listen, the way you let go." Naoki nodded. He felt no pride, no nervousness, only gratitude. That afternoon, as he guided the younger students in cleaning the garden, a gust of wind stirred a flurry of petals. One landed in his palm. He held it for a moment, then let it go, not as a symbolic gesture, but as something natural. Letting go had become as easy as breathing. The sun slowly descended behind the mountains. The temple bells rang in the distance, and Naoki understood, not with his mind, but with his whole being, that there's nothing to fear in this world once you learn not to cling. Because when you stop demanding the world to be permanent, everything becomes sacred. Every sound, every step, every goodbye, every meeting, every moment. And so his search came to an end, not with a grand revelation or a final answer, but with a clear gaze, an open mind, a heart that no longer wished to possess, only to embrace. Naoki no longer needed to leave, nor to stay. Wherever he was, it was already home. And the wind, as always, passed by, carrying with it the final word.